Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Scientist at Home series from the American Museum of Natural History. My name is Ruth Angus, and I'm a curator in the astrophysics department at the museum. And I specialize in stars and planets, the stars in our galaxy and the planets that orbit them. And I spend my time at the museum doing research into astronomy and astrophysics. And today I'm going to talk to you about a topic that I'm really interested in that isn't the topic of my research. It's about how the imagination and works of fiction have inspired real science, and specifically space exploration. So I'm going to share some slides with you now. So I'd like to start by talking about this image. So this is an artist's impression of a planet that orbits the star nearest to the sun. The star is called Proxima Centauri, and the planet is called Proxima Centauri b. And it's 4 light years away from the Earth. It takes the light from the sun 4 years to get there. And it is 100 million times further away from the Earth than the moon is. And getting there would be by far the most ambitious feat of space exploration ever undertaken. But if we were to send a spacecraft to explore Proxima Centauri b, it would be the culmination of over 150 years of imagination and visionary work and research in space exploration and astronomy. And in this talk, I'm going to take you on that 150-year journey and explain just how we might get to Proxima Centauri b. So let me start at the very beginning with the inventor herself, Mary Shelley. Mary Shelley is credited with being the first person to write a novel in the science fiction genre. And everyone's heard of her book, Frankenstein. Frankenstein was the first novel which took science that kind of existed today at the time, that was established, and then she imagined a near future and kind of extrapolated what the science of the day was saying, to imagine a world in which the science kind of took over. And she was the first person to do this, but many years later, Jules Verne took up her mantle, and he continued to write works of science fiction. He was fascinated with exploration, and he'd just written Journey to the Center of the Earth. And for his next novel, he turned his gaze upwards to the sky, and he wrote this book, From Earth to the Moon. And this was really the first example of a work of fiction that involved travel in space at all. And it's kind of crazy to think that right now, just because space exploration just seems like such an obvious thing to us. Like going to the moon seems like an obvious goal, but at the time that Jules Verne was writing, it wasn't obvious at all. And he basically came up with this idea. And he was kind of a nerd, actually, Jules Verne. Like, he was actually quite scientifically literate, and he worked through all the maths that you would need in order to get to the moon. So he did the maths before we even decided to send a spacecraft to the moon. And also, he actually was the first person to use the words spaceship. So he invented that term. Now, in this book, From Earth to the Moon, Jules Verne's protagonists were a group of explorers who were launched to the moon inside a cannon. So they were fired from a cannon. They were inside a space capsule. And although Jules Verne's book, From Earth to the Moon, was actually very scientifically accurate in many ways because he worked through all of the maths, this part wasn't. You couldn't send people to the moon in a cannon, just because the acceleration that they would experience when the cannon blasted off would smush everybody. But the principle is actually kind of solid. Like, if you sent a projectile from a cannon at the right speed, you could feasibly reach the moon. And there were some elements of his story that were kind of spookily accurate. So, for example, his space capsule was called the Columbiad, and the space capsule that took the Apollo 11 astronauts to the moon was called the Columbia. And also, The Columbiad was launched from Florida, and the Apollo 11 mission also launched from Florida. And although in Jules Verne's story, the astronauts were launched from a cannon rather than a rocket, he did understand the forces that were needed to get a space capsule from the Earth to the moon. It's just that in the Apollo missions, people were sent by rocket ships which accelerate more slowly so that people kind of can stay alive, basically. Oh yeah, one other thing. Jules Verne predicted that the astronauts would come back to Earth and splash down in the Pacific Ocean, and that's exactly what they did in Apollo 11. So in this book, this was such a pioneering book, which sort of brought the idea of space exploration to the public, and it sparked the imagination of people living at the time. And Jules Verne predicted the future so well, so accurately, because he used real science. And that is a theme that kind of recurs throughout the science fiction canon, throughout all the literature. People use real science, they build upon the real science to create stories that could be feasible, and that's what makes a great story. So about 30 years later, I wanted to tell a different story. This is Percival Lowell, who was a real astronomer working in 1895 at the turn of the century. And back then, we weren't able to take photographs of the sky and objects in the night sky. Instead, people had to look through a telescope and draw what they saw. It's not the best way to do astronomy. We certainly don't do it that way anymore, but that was all that they could do at the time. And Percival Lowell looked through his telescope and he looked at the surface of Mars, and he saw these strange straight lines on the surface, like kind of geometric patterns. And he basically decided that the only thing that could possibly create such incredibly straight lines on the surface must have been created by an alien intelligence. And he called these things canals. He said that perhaps there are intelligent Martians living on the surface of Mars that are building these structures. It turns out that Percy Lowell was wrong about this. He was actually seeing an optical illusion that is created by looking through a really low resolution telescope. And it actually wasn't until Mariner 4 in 1965 imaged the surface of Mars that these Martian canals were fully debunked. And today we know that Mars doesn't have any structures like this on its surface, but Percival Lowell's ideas about aliens living on Mars completely took the public's imagination by storm. And there were so many pieces of fiction written about Martians. And if you've ever wondered why so many stories about aliens feature Martians, it's basically because of Percival Lowell. There's actually some more to this story, so feel free to ask a question at the end if you want to hear more. So fast forward a couple of years, just 3 years after Lowell was making his drawings of Mars, and H.G. Wells comes on the scene. Now, he is another really famous science fiction writer. And one of his most famous works was War of the Worlds. And in War of the Worlds, some Martian alien robot things come down to Earth and they just blow things up. Specifically, they come to Surrey, England, which incidentally is where I'm from. And H.G. Wells, he was building on the ideas that were laid down by Percy Lowell. Incorrect ideas, but nonetheless, he was still basing these ideas on ideas that were around at the time. And then he also built upon Jules Verne's work too by writing this book, The First Men in the Moon. H.G. Wells, he also popularized the term outer space. So before Wells's books, people would talk about space, but the outer bit that goes on the front of it, that was popularized by Wells. To be honest, I don't really know why we use the expression outer space. Space seems fine to me. Wells he actually had a degree in biology, so he had a background in science. So the works of Verne and Wells inspired a whole new set of science fiction both in literature and in film. And this, A Trip to the Moon, was the first film that was the first science fiction film ever made. And in this film, a group of explorers are fired in a cannon, just like in Jules Verne's book, to the moon. And they go towards the moon. There's this incredible cinematic moment. It goes down in history. And they land on the surface and they explore this weird alien landscape. And in the film, you can see that there are some weird like alien mushrooms, and there are some aliens, alien creatures jumping around. And this was actually really typical of the time. So because of Percival Lowell's drawings of Mars, people loved to think about the idea that there were aliens on the surfaces of the planets in our solar system. We now know that that's not true, but it was still, all of these ideas really led to the excitement around space exploration and were really important. So in this era, turn of the century, Jules Verne and H.G. Wells, between them, they inspired a whole generation of rocket scientists. And it would be those rocket scientists that read the works of these two men as kids who would grow up to be rocket scientists whose work was absolutely fundamental in the space race. So in 1969, we sent people to the moon. 600 million people watched as Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walked on the surface of the moon. And as they were heading back down to Earth, Neil Armstrong acknowledged the fact that Jules Verne had predicted this voyage 100 years before. And he said the following thing in a broadcast. He said, 100 years ago, Jules Verne wrote a book about a voyage to the moon. His spaceship, Columbiad, took off from Florida and landed in the Pacific Ocean after completing a trip to the moon. It seems appropriate to us to share with you some of the reflections of the crew as the modern-day Columbia completes its rendezvous with the planet Earth and the same Pacific Ocean tomorrow. So Neil Armstrong was a fan of Jules Verne, and I'm sure he grew up reading a lot of science fiction himself. So after we walked on the moon, there was a new era of science fiction, and a lot of new science fiction writers, including many incredible women whose science fiction works are some of my favorite. And we continue to send people into space, as you'll see later on today with the SpaceX launch. And so we still have people in space, but human space exploration has kind of been put on pause for a while. But space exploration itself still goes on. It's just that now it's being done by robots, but it is space exploration nonetheless. And these robots have made incredible scientific discoveries, like Cassini imaged Saturn, and Juno, which imaged Jupiter. And this is New Horizons, which flew past Pluto in 2015. And it is kind of crazy to me that in 2015, we still didn't know what the surface of Pluto really looked like. Pluto, we've known about Pluto for so long. Pluto's been in our hearts for so long. It's one of the most important members of the solar system. And we didn't know what its surface was like in 2015. And then New Horizons flew by and revealed a beautiful high-resolution image of the surface of Pluto and revealed Pluto's heart, which is now so famous. I just think it's amazing that that happened in 2015. That is so recent. Space exploration is continuing beyond the solar system too. So this is another significant moment in my astronomy career, the launch of this spacecraft in 2009, Kepler. And Kepler is a space telescope that I use a lot in my own research. And Kepler has been searching for planets outside of the solar system. These are called extrasolar planets or exoplanets, just like Proxima Centauri b that I mentioned at the beginning. And Kepler's found over 5,000 of these planets, and it's its follower, TESS, is finding even more of these planets. And the planets that we now know exist outside of our solar system, thanks to Kepler, are some really kind of wacky places that are almost stranger than fiction. But some of them were actually predicted by science fiction. And probably the most famous example of this is Kepler 16 and Kepler 43, which are circumbinary planetary systems. So that means that there are planets orbiting double stars. And in Star Wars, Luke Skywalker grows up on Tatooine, and there's this really famous shot from the movie with two suns in the background. And this is just one example of a lot of planetary systems that were thought up by science fiction writers, including George Lucas. There are actually lots of other planetary systems in Star Wars that have real analogs that we've discovered. So once again, science fiction kind of got there first. Science fiction predicted all of these weird and wacky planetary systems that we would end up discovering are real. But what's next? So this is Proxima Centauri. It's that star that I showed at the beginning, which has a planet around it. And it's the nearest star to the sun, 4 light years away. But to get there would take far too long with the current technology that we've been using to explore space. So, for example, New Horizons, which flew past Pluto, would take another 100,000 years to get to Proxima Centauri. It's not even heading in the right direction, but if it were, it would take a really long time to get there, far longer than humans could ever survive. So, in order to get to Proxima Centauri, either with robots or with people, we definitely need some new technology. And the technology that we need was once again predicted by Jules Verne in his book, From the Earth to the Moon. So Jules Verne, when he was working at the time, he was really aware of the discoveries that were happening in science. And so he knew about Maxwell's discovery of radiation pressure. So he knew that light itself could be used as a propulsion system. And in this book, one character says to another, "Is it not evident then, I ask you, that there will someday appear velocities far greater than these, of which light or electricity will probably be the mechanical agent?" So he predicted something called light sailing or solar sailing. And this is a method of space travel that we know works, where a sail in space gathers up the light that is being radiated either by the sun or by some lasers that are pointing at it, and is propelled by the momentum of the photons that hit its surface. Jules Verne predicted this in 1865, and lots of other science fiction writers have written about this idea as well, solar sailing or light sailing. And this is an image from Light Sail 2, which was a real light sail that was deployed. And it is technology like this that could possibly reach the kinds of speeds that we would need to get to Proxima Centauri. So there is an initiative called Breakthrough Starshot, which is a plan to send a fleet of light sails to Proxima Centauri b, and they'll be powered by an array of lasers, giant lasers. And they'll make it up to a significant fraction of the speed of light. So that they would actually get to Proxima Centauri in just a few years. So who knows, maybe in future, space exploration will go interstellar. And maybe a probe, a robot, or perhaps even a human will make it to Proxima Centauri b, and we'll have left our solar system for the first time. So in this talk, I just wanted to really, highlight the point that the incredible journey that we've gone on from first imagining space travel to reiterating on that point, to developing new technology and learning about new science, to building rocket ships to actually go into the moon, has all been a chain of events that have been driven by innovation and imagination. Now that we've got to the moon, the process shouldn't stop. We should continue to imagine new voyages and a new world and what it would be like to get there and how we could go there, so that we continue to explore space well into the future. That's it for my talk. Thank you so much for listening. I'm going to take questions now, so please stick around. So the first question is, will scientists find another planet for us to live in? So the hunt is on, absolutely. This is something that we've been focusing on a lot. Kepler has been searching for planets like that we call Earth 2.0 sometimes, like a planet just like the Earth that we could live on. And the truth is, we found candidates, but it's very difficult to know whether or not a planet is really habitable without going there, or without getting some extremely detailed measurements of what the surface is like, what the atmosphere would be like, what the temperature is like, which we would need with technology that probably doesn't quite exist yet. So we're definitely looking, and it's promising, but we don't know. It's possible that Proxima Centauri b could be a planet that we could live on, but who knows? Okay, another question. What do you think will happen to people after generations in space? Yes, this is a good question, and this is something that is also a really common topic in science fiction novels. People aren't very good at living in space. Basically, we're not very good at living in very low gravity, because our bones basically would weaken over time. We'd lose a lot of muscle strength, which would lead to complications. And so we would have to simulate gravity in some way. 2001: A Space Odyssey does a good job of this. So if you have a centrifuge and you spin a part of the spacecraft, you can simulate gravity. There are other reasons why it's difficult to live in space for a long time, like radiation. You get a lot of radiation from very high energy cosmic particles when you're in space for a long time. So this again is something that we don't really have the technology for it yet, but we think we know maybe how we could do it. It just takes some more innovation. Okay, another question. Is it true that people are trying to colonize the moon? I'm sure that people would like to colonize the moon. I don't know from a financial perspective how well it would work. And I don't know of any like concrete plans where people are really planning to do it. It's really hard. It's really hard to live in space. Like, we're not supposed to live in space, and the moon doesn't have an atmosphere, and so it wouldn't be an easy place to live. Mars could potentially be easier, but it's so much further away, so that has added difficulties. There are some people as well who actually think Venus could be easier to colonize. So Venus is not a good place to live. It's really hot, and there's sulfuric acid in the atmosphere. But actually, if you floated in the cloud deck of Venus in a series of balloons, it's possible that Venus could actually be even more habitable than Mars. You could basically get the right altitude so that you'd have the right temperature and the right pressure. And if you have the right temperature and the right pressure, those are the two kind of hardest things to get right when you're colonizing a new planet. So maybe Venus will be the thing. But again, I don't know of any real plans, concrete plans. So another question, will other planets such as Mars become habitable as the sun gets hotter? And the answer to this is yes, maybe. So Mars, one of the reasons why it's not habitable is because it's very cold, and that's because it's far away from the sun, further away from the sun than the Earth is. As the sun evolves, though, it will get hotter. And so Mars, the temperature of Mars will heat up. Unfortunately, Mars still doesn't have a very thick atmosphere, so that kind of presents another problem there with Mars. But actually, interestingly, Currently in our solar system, Earth is the only habitable planet. It's the only planet of the right temperature to have liquid water on its surface. But if you swapped the positions of Mars and Jupiter, then they would both be the right temperature to have liquid water on their surface. And the reason is that Venus is really close to the sun and it has a thick atmosphere. If you moved it out, its atmosphere would keep it warm due to the greenhouse effect. And it could be the right temperature if it was at the position of Mars. And similarly, if you moved Mars inwards, it's got a thin atmosphere, so it's cold. And so it can handle quite a lot more radiation from the sun. So if you moved Mars to where Venus is, it might be the right temperature. Okay, what do I think is the most accurate science fiction work in recent years? Oh, this is a good question. So Seven Eves, the book, is quite accurate. I like the first 2/3 of that book. I'm not so sure about the last third. But there are some fantastic accuracies regarding space travel in that book. And another, so Interstellar, the film, is often credited with being quite scientifically accurate. It's not very scientifically accurate. It's just that there is a kind of visual of a black hole, which is really realistic. That part is realistic, but that film talks about exploring exoplanets, distant planets, including a planet that orbits a black hole. Planets do orbit black holes, we found them, but what the planet would be like, a planet that's orbiting a black hole, that's quite difficult to imagine. And I think they took some artistic license in that film. But Interstellar, they did a decent job. Okay, another question, how is a planet made? So planets are made at around the same time that stars are made. So all the planets in our solar system were made at a similar time, or like just after the sun formed. And they're actually formed from the leftover material from the sun. So planets are made, the inner planets are made of rocky materials, like lots of silicon, because those are the materials that were available in the interior of the debris disk that was left over from the sun's formation. And the outer planets, the icy worlds, they were made slightly differently. They started with small cores, and then they gathered gas because they're so massive. They gathered a lot of gas because they're further out. They had more time to grow because material hung around in the outer solar system for longer than it did in the inner solar system. Every planet has like a little bit of a different formation story, but I have to say that there are lots of details of planet formation that we still don't understand, and we cannot yet go from a computer simulation. We can't go from start to finish. We can't go from dust and gas to Earth, Mars, and Jupiter. We can't do that yet. So there are lots of unknowns in this process. Okay, so this question is, how do we get people other than astronauts from between habitable planets? So if we do find a second habitable planet, how would we get there? Yeah, this is a good question. And this again is really where science fiction has run away with this idea of interstellar travel. Interstellar travel is really hard. You have to go fast if you want to get anywhere significant in the galaxy. Stars are really far apart. Our nearest star, Proxima Centauri, is still 4 light years away, and that's our nearest star. Most of the stars that we're finding habitable planets around are much further away, like 100 times further away. And so even getting to Proxima Cen is a challenge. Getting anywhere else is even more of a challenge. And I talked about light sails and solar sails in this talk as a potential mechanism for getting there. But in reality, if you want to get to one of these stars within a human lifetime, you have to accelerate up to a significant fraction of the speed of light. And that's harder the more mass you add. So as a light sail, they're designed to be really light. So you can accelerate them relatively easily. If you add a human, that's a lot more weight. Solar sails, they're just a few grams usually. So adding a human is a significant increase in weight. Plus, you can't just stick a human on it. You've got to add all of the life support that humans need, etc. So this is like a big unsolved problem in space exploration now. Solar sailing and light sailing has potential, but it might not be the solution. And there's an interesting paradox called the Fermi paradox, which I won't go into too much detail now. Google it. It basically implies that it's possible that interstellar space travel just isn't possible. It's not solvable. Okay, this question, do we think a child will ever be recruited to travel on a mission to space? I'd say it's definitely unlikely to happen anytime soon, I'm afraid. So if the person who asked that, Kari, if you're a child, it might not be you. I think that this would be many, many years in the future when space travel is extremely reliable, when maybe when we are starting to colonize space stations or planets or whatever, is going to be a long time in the future. Space travel right now is still very dangerous. It's going to take a lot of innovation and interest. Maybe space tourism will help us get there, but I think it will be a while. Okay, this last question: are space elevators a real thing that could happen? Yes, I don't really know. So I've heard people talk about space elevators. So basically a structure that reaches up out into the atmosphere that just spins with the Earth and could just lift people up into space. I don't know. To be honest, I haven't heard a huge amount about that as the next innovation, but you never know. I'd say it's probably unlikely. I think it's very difficult to get something like that to work, but I don't know. I'm not an engineer. Maybe it is possible. Okay, well, that's all the time we have for questions. Thank you so much for everyone who asked a question. Just one last thing. So for anyone who's interested in joining the Ology Challenge, this is a fun activity that is mostly aimed at kids, but if any adults want to do it, you're more than welcome. And this Ology Challenge, it's just a challenge, just something fun that you can do at home. And this time you get to design your own science fiction travel guide. And there will be a link to all of the details. You'll get to download a template. And in this challenge, what you have to do is you basically have to use your imagination to think about what space exploration trip you would go on. And when you're doing this challenge, you could think about where you'd like to go. Would you like to go to the moon? Would you like to go to Mars or Pluto or beyond? Maybe distant stars, maybe interstellar space travel. And think about what it would be like to travel there. Would you be shot from a cannon, or would you be propelled by a rocket, or use a light sail, or something else, something completely different that no one's ever thought of before? And also think about what you might see there. Would your destination have alien life, or would it be the start of a new colony? Go wild with this challenge. You might want to use real science as your inspiration, because so many works of science fiction do use real science, and often a story is improved if you include some realistic elements in it. But you don't have to. You can use your imagination and get crazy. So thanks everybody so much for listening. Good luck with the Ology Challenge. The deadline is going to be the 6th of June, or the 7th of June, I believe. So get going. you can download the travel guide. And just before you go, please, if you feel like it, fill out a survey. It really helps us. Just a survey about the Scientists at Home series. Please let us know what you think. We'd love to hear from you. Okay, thanks everybody. Take care.